Hi, everybody. This is Byron Jacobs from dmbpoker.com, and I'm doing another in our series of interviews that I do occasionally with authors who've written books. And today I'm delighted to welcome John Little. John, hi, how you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure. And today we're going to be promoting and talking about this book, 100 Essential Tips to Master No Limit Hold'em. John's written loads of books for us. I've got many of them on the shelf behind me over there, but this one came out late last year. And so we're a little bit late, and John's got it there, as you can see. So we're a little bit late doing this interview, but people may have not seen the book or not know so much about it, and this might give them some information about what they can actually find in the book and how it would help them. Before we get onto the book, John, I know you've had some good results at the table over the last few months. Perhaps you'd like to tell people a little bit about that.
So I've made a point to play a lot more poker over the last 2 years or so. My kids are getting a little bit older. I'm able to travel for slightly longer periods of time. So I've been making a point to play a lot of high roller tournaments, mainly in the Poker Go studio in Las Vegas, because those get good publicity. The venue is amazingly nice. They don't charge rake or minimum. They charge minimal rake if you show up on time. They give you free food. It's a really, really, really good setup. So I've been making a point to play a lot of those tournament series over the last 2 years. And for the first year or so, I was taking a whole lot of fifth to ninth places, which is quite frustrating. But I recognize fully that you win an extra flip at the end of the tournament, then you're the tournament. And I kept at it, and I recently won the Poker Go Cup, which was one of their 3 main tournament series each year that includes something like 10 tournaments back to back to back. Took a first, and I think a fourth and a sixth or something like that over the course of that 2-week period. I also won another $5,000 buy-in tournament there recently. And things have been pretty good. So I've been making a point to study a lot, work hard, and play more. And it seems like things are coming together nicely.
It sounds like it's working okay. This leads me into my second question. Obviously, you produce a huge amount of content. You've done all these books for us. You've got loads of material on your own site, and God knows what else you do as well. Do you find that really feeds into your game, that study and work and writing that you do? Does it help you when you're actually at the table?
I think whenever anyone plays a game, essentially they are showing up and implementing the strategy that they already know, assuming they have thought about the game ahead of time at all, and I've thought about poker more than most people, right? So by having to study and having to be good and having to be able to educate my students, I am required to get very good at poker. And I've made a point to hire many of the best poker players in the world to make content at pokercoaching.com. Some of them write D&B books. And I learn from all of them. I mean, I consume all that content, I go through it, and I essentially curate it and design it to help other people get really good at poker. So having to do that on a very regular basis forces me to study. And I probably study more than most poker players, which is good for me. I mean, if anything, I lack the time to go and actually sit at the table and play, because many years ago, I would play poker every single day, either live or online. And now I play poker maybe 2 weeks out of the month. But at the same time, it provides better balance. I'm more motivated when I go to play. I'm never burnt out. And I think there's a lot of benefit in that as well.
That makes a lot of sense, and also it adds to the your experience clearly makes it valid that studying the game does pay off. You've had all these good results recently. That doesn't happen out of nowhere. Returning to the book. Okay, so we've got this book, 100 Essential Tips, that John's just written. Now, obviously, many of you watching this video may love John. You may love his stuff. You might got loads of his other material. So if I can play slight devil's advocate here, they might be thinking, well, I love John's stuff, but I got all these other books. Why do I need this one? So maybe you can explain to people what they're going to get out of this book that, is above and beyond what they might have seen previously.
Yeah, this book is exactly what the title says. It's 100 Essential Tips to Master No Limit Hold'em. There are essentially 100 articles on specific topics that you must understand if you want to succeed at poker. For example, I'm just looking through one of them right here. Play tighter in multi-way pots. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't, but there's a 4-page article on the fact that you need to play tighter in multi-way pots, primarily because you are going to be against players whose ranges should be reasonable, and they're going to be dominating a lot of your medium strength hands. Like, say it goes raise before you and then everyone else folds and you have king 8 offsuit in the big blind, you should call the vast majority of the time. But if it goes raise, call, king 8 should be a fold because you're going to be incredibly dominated. And you're also out of position against multiple people, and you're going to substantially under-realize your equity. This is an important point. And if you do not know that, you're going to have a really rough time, especially with the very marginal hands. So even though you're getting better pot odds, you're going to realize your equity very, very poorly. So there are 100 topics just like that in the book. And I designed it so that you could essentially sit down and read one at a time if you wanted. So instead of having to read an entire chapter at a time on a broad topic like how to play the turn when you're check to, instead we discuss a little bit more specific scenarios that you need to understand. And so you can get something out of it, even if you only have 5 minutes to sit down and read.
It makes a lot of sense because I know nowadays one of the great complaints with social media and everything that's happening is that we've all lost our ability to concentrate for long periods of time. This is fairly standardly spouted by people, all the time. So if you're breaking stuff down into like bite-sized chunks, like you say, if someone's just got 5 minutes, maybe they can absorb something in 5 minutes and they don't have to sit there for like an hour and a half watching a video or something, and they've maybe zoned out after about 10 minutes, or they're looking at their phone or whatever, something like that.
Yeah, I've actually made a point to make most of my content recently in much more bite-sized chunks, because if you do have an hour to sit, you can go for an hour. But if you only have 10 minutes, I don't want you to have to stop 10 minutes into a video and then have to figure out where you were in the last time you came and probably in the middle of a sentence or a paragraph. And it's not an ideal user experience. So now the majority of content at makeitpokercoaching.com is 15 minutes or shorter, although there'll be many more parts to call it a series, right?
Yeah.
And this book is very similar to that, where I think maybe the longest, call it chapter in this book, is maybe like 6 pages, which is not that long. So you're getting very applicable information that's concise, and it'll teach you something in a very short period of time if that's all the time you have. Because I realize life is hectic.
Absolutely, life is hectic for everyone, and it's only going to get worse. So that will certainly be helpful. Obviously, the book is broken up. I mean, there are 100 different topics that you cover, but it's broken up. You've got like the obvious categories like pre-flop, post-flop, but within that, there's often like, I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 articles on continuation betting and other slightly more narrower topics. If you had to choose maybe 1 or 2 areas that you think people tend to really maybe misplay or not understand well from your experience of working with your students, etc., could you maybe identify them where you think that they could, what are the sort of hot spots that they should think about zooming in on?
I mean, I would say all of poker, unfortunately. The thing is that most people have 5 or 10 glaring holes in their game if they're not a good, strong, winning player. And the thing is, you don't necessarily know where those 5 or 10 spots are, because if someone is, let's say, far too loose and aggressive, probably bluffing way too often on all betting rounds, maybe just the flop and the turn. Who knows? It's impossible to say because you have to look at each individual player. I mean, that said, I think a lot of people think that pre-flop poker is relatively easy because all you have to do is follow a chart. Just trying to play GTO strategies. But a lot of people do not follow the charts well for whatever reason. I mean, from out of position, a lot of players do not bluff nearly often enough. They may never bluff. They may just re-raise only the best hands, and that makes them really, really easy to play against. So you need to make sure that you're starting each hand with reasonable ranges. Otherwise, you're going to be either way too strong or way too weak, depending on your pre-flop strategy, going to the flop, and then that's going to persist on the turn and the river, and then you're just going to have glaring holes in your game that if your opponents are paying attention at all, they're going to be able to easily crush you. I mean, tonight I'm playing a cash game, and I know for a fact 3 of the players play far too loosely pre-flop, which means either on the flop or the turn or the river or all 3, or some combination of the 2, they're going to have ranges that are far too junky. And I know these players compensate for this by bluffing far too often. So my strategy becomes really easy. Make a pair and don't fold, right? And sure, you're going to lose sometimes, but understanding their glaring mistake of having too much junk in their range and understanding what they're willing to do about it, because some people just check fold with a lot of junk. Other players will bluff it. That's going to heavily impact your strategy. But look, in terms of broad tips, it's difficult to say specific things that people need to do differently because poker players make all sorts of blunders, which make it a great game. I definitely do think a lot of people don't necessarily keep a proper bankroll for most games. Just from posting on Twitter at Jonathan Little, people there seem to think you need 30 buy-ins to play tournaments or 10 buy-ins to play cash games. And even if you have a humongous edge, That's nowhere near enough. You are going to go on downswings, even if you are very good, and a lot of people don't realize that. Um, I don't know when this video is going to go out, but the World Series of Poker is coming up relatively soon. And if you're playing tournaments that have 2,000 people in it, you need a ton of buy-ins because you don't take final table of a 2,000 person tournament all that often, right? And a lot of people don't recognize that. I think a lot of people don't understand what they are signing up for when they go to play a tournament series or a cash game session, whatever. Like you can go to a casino and play for 8 hours and just get almost entirely bad cards. You just have to fold every hand. And I mean, that you certainly didn't drive to the casino to fold every hand, but sometimes that's what you have to do. And I think people need to have a good perception of the reality they have signed up for. And I think a lot of people do not.
Okay, it's interesting what you're saying because the gist of it seems to me to be that mistakes don't happen in one particular category. Like if you get the pre-flop play wrong, then it's going to impact what you're doing on the subsequently post-flop turn and river, etc., etc. So it's important to have your game working as one coherent whole rather than fragmented bits and pieces. The next thing I'd like to discuss, I think people might be interesting, is obviously you've been playing poker for a long time now. And I'm wondering what you've noticed has changed. Obviously, people have got much better. I mean, that kind of goes without saying because there's so much more information around now. But are there things that people are doing now that they maybe didn't do before that aren't necessarily related to being more skillful? Just is everybody like more aggressive or something, or do they? I don't know. Have certain habits started that weren't maybe there like 5, 10 years ago, something like that?
So it depends on which type of player pool you're looking at. But in the higher stakes games, the idea that I can kind of do whatever I want and outplay my opponent has gone out the window. That does not exist anymore because everyone has studied a decent amount. I mean, I'm just thinking about some of the high roller tournaments I play. There are some players in the past who were overly loose, maniacal, and aggressive. And certainly they still have those tendencies, but they're not playing half of the hands before the flop anymore. They're playing much closer to a reasonable number. And essentially the very exploitative plays that perhaps worked at a particular time or against particular players just does not work if your opponents know to revert to strong game theory optimal strategies. So everyone was forced to get better. I mean, you see a lot of the call them big names from back in 2004. A lot of them are not playing high stakes tournaments at all. I mean, there's a small handful that if you watch the biggest games that are still there playing and competing, and for all we know, some of them are losing. And that's because they've not learned to play fundamentally sound strategies. And if you don't know what good game theory optimal strategies look like, or at least some idea of it, you're going to get absolutely crushed. And that's just the reality of any game. As time progresses, people typically get better at it. And if you're not always improving your skills, you're getting behind.
Sure. Obviously, you tend to play in big tournaments with the better players. Yeah, but from the feedback from your students and making material from your students, you must have quite a good idea of how people play sort of lower down the food chain, so to speak, in the lower buy-in events. And are there things there that you've noticed that have changed particularly?
I mean, so look, people in the past would make all sorts of errors, one way or the other, and they still do today. But the errors they make are usually not so profound and they're less frequent because even in the smaller and medium stakes games, players have gotten substantially better. I mean, a long time ago, if you went and played a $3,500 buy-in main event that had 1,000 players, you can be very sure that if you showed up to your first table, probably 7 out of the 9 players there would be really bad. Like you just had to show up and you get a double up in the first 2 hours very consistently. Today, you show up, there might be 2 or 3 very bad players. Maybe one, maybe none, who knows, right? And very rarely will there now be 7 very bad players. So the mistakes the players make are still very similar, but there are fewer and fewer players who are making such big mistakes. And that's just always going to be the case as you move up to higher and higher buy-in levels. As you go to lower and lower buy-in levels, people are still making all sorts of common mistakes. I mean, if you go and you sit and you play a $50 tournament in a local casino, players are going to be limping, or someone's going to raise and then 7 people call them and they're playing a lot of multi-way pots. And that's not good, fundamentally sound poker. But if you are playing those games, you certainly need to know how to deal with those scenarios, which very simply is just play better cards than your opponents and then put money in when you're heavily favored. It's not that hard to win if your opponents are playing all sorts of trash. But that's something you need to be aware of, right? So I don't think the mistakes people are making have changed so much, but they're making fewer of those mistakes because people are getting better. I mean, one thing people are learning very clearly is they're learning to play the early betting rounds better in general. For example, a long time ago, if somebody raised, you were in the big blind with anything that wasn't decent, a lot of players would just fold. But now they know they're supposed to call pretty wide or re-raise. Most of the time they err towards calling. But then they don't know how to play post-flop all that well, which is going to involve a decent amount of check raising, especially if the flop is good for the big blind's defending range. So a lot of these players will call pre-flop and then just drastically overfold to a flop bet. So that may actually allow you to raise even wider than before because you're not going to get your pre-flop bluff through, but you will get your flop bluff through way more often than you should. So typically people play worse and worse as they get to the later betting rounds because they have less experience. And because of that, a lot of people still have mistakes in those scenarios, especially on the turn in the river.
Okay, so that's covered quite nicely a number of topics that are touched upon in this book, which is the one that we're talking about. Is there anything else you'd like to tell people who are thinking about buying the book that will encourage them to do so, that we haven't covered already?
Books are relatively cheap. Educational content is relatively cheap, especially when it comes to things that you are learning that can potentially make you money. If you're buying into a $100 buy-in tournament, it would be ridiculous to not spend a little bit of time and effort and money studying concise content that's been put together exactly for you and players like you to help you improve your poker skills. So, I mean, look, I've spent a ton of money on poker coaching. I've read almost every poker book, and I'm very, very happy I did. And I'm going to continue spending a bunch of money on coaching and hiring the best coaches at pokercoaching.com and reading every book that comes out. And that's just part of being very, very good at something. If you're not working hard and studying, you will get behind. And if you get behind in poker, you're going to lose a bunch of money. And I don't want you to lose a bunch of money. I'd rather you win.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, John. And everyone should know that this book is, as I said, it came out late last year. So it's available from all the usual channels, both in the UK, the US and Europe. So thanks very much for your time, John. And good luck with your continued assaults on the the tournaments at Poker Go. We look forward to seeing you winning more of them.
Alrighty.
Thanks very much, John. Cheers.